Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast. I am Jim Beitler, here with my co-host, Aaron Hill, and today it's just the two of us.
Yeah.
We thought we'd do something a little different on the podcast today, and that is we wanted to talk about some of our favorite books. This podcast is all about books, and we're going to be talking about some by the Wade authors, some not by the Wade authors.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of intersections between the selections by the Wade authors and those that aren't by the Wade authors.
Yeah, and we want to invite you, the listeners, actually, to chime in. So we're going to be sharing some of our favorite books, our sort of, I think that we said top 5, but I think you and I brought boxes. Boxes full of books.
As soon as I framed it as top 5, then I thought that was a bad idea.
Yeah. So, but we'd like to invite you guys as listeners, actually, to send us your reflections on your top 5. Hopefully some of them would include Wade authors, but obviously there's going to be other books that played a role in your intellectual and spiritual development. And so we would love to hear from you guys. So as you're listening, if you're inspired, if you want to participate, we're actually going to have a part 2 of this podcast. I think our conversation, we're not going to be able to cover all of this in just one episode.
No.
And so we're going to come back and do a part 2, and we would love for you guys to email us at wade@wheaton.edu. Email us your top 5 books or more than that, and a little summary reflection of how some of those influenced you, and we'll hopefully read some of those on air in our next episode. We'd love to get to know you guys a little bit better.
That's right.
And then for you guys to get to know us better. And then it's never a bad time to talk about books.
That's right. And if you have questions too, you can also include questions with your email. That's fine too. And we'll maybe even read some of what you've written on the air.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jim, what is your first book? And maybe give us a little bit of background, about yourself, especially for listeners who are just getting to know you.
Yeah. So, the first book is a difficult choice. But I wanted to do Wade author. And I thought, I'm going to start with the Chronicles of Narnia.
Okay. Well, that's not, is that one book though?
Well, no, that's not the book.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you what the book is.
Oh, okay. I was like, man, you're cheating already out of the gate here.
That's right. I'm going to start with 7. No, no, my first book is The Magician's Nephew.
Oh, yeah.
And I first read the Chronicles of Narnia when I was little, and I have a very distinct memory of reading it. I think my mom gave them to me.
Oh, okay.
And I know that my parents both read to me in bed, Chronicles of Narnia, but the memory is of me reading them alone.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember that I was so caught up in the story that I couldn't put these books down. And so I would actually get sore from sitting in one particular location.
Oh, wow.
So I remember reading the Chronicles of Narnia kind of through the house.
Yeah.
And in one particular case, I remember being on the stairs, reading the book and kind of traveling around the house. So anyway, The Magician's Nephew, I've read this book a number of times over the years, but I just love that moment when Aslan sings creation into existence. That for me is just this really poignant moment. And of course, you have the different reactions of all the characters to that moment.
Yeah.
So, Polly and Diggory are acting one way, and the cabbie in particular is acting one way. He when things are still dark, he says, something's happened. We need to sing a hymn. And it's a good instinct.
Yeah.
So this is a beautiful moment. And of course, the witch and Uncle Andrew are reacting in a totally different way. But Aslan, Aslan's purposes will not be thwarted. And there's that great moment where the lamppost bar is thrown and it becomes the lamppost of Narnia. And the whole idea of creation and for our authors, subcreation, it was just so important to them. And there are so many resonances between that opening of the opening of Narnia, and the opening of Tolkien's world, of course, with the Ina Lindalay of singing creation into existence.
Yeah.
So I've always been taken by that.
How old were you when you read the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time?
I'm not exactly sure. I'm thinking it was probably 8 or 9.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
and what about that shaped your worldview as a 8 or 9-year-old? How did that change you reading the book series?
That's great. I think it was more like enculturation. There wasn't. I don't think I was making the allegorical connections
Yeah.
To the extent that they were there. But I was, I think it did shape me, kind of quietly shape me.
Yeah.
And, it was my first exposure to Lewis.
Yeah.
And so then when my mom later handed me her worn copy of Mere Christianity.
Oh, okay.
When I was older, I was eager to take it up and got something different, but also very important.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you have a book like that, Aaron, that was important early on?
Yeah, so it's interesting. As I was thinking through and getting ready for this, I've got a room with, just shelves and shelves of books and stuff. And it's like, how do you pick? How do you pick?
No.
And so what I realized is like my life, I could kind of be split into like 3 stages.
Yeah.
I'm going to go over the first 2 stages really quickly because most of my books are from the 3rd stage, which is recent. But when I was younger, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian denomination, very conservative, evangelical, loving church, loving parents, loving family. I have nothing negative to say about any of that. But the world that I grew up in was very focused on like obedience. And I guess that was where my heart was this idea like, I'm going to be the best Christian possible. I'm going to be the best son. I'm going to be the best follower of Christ. And so I was really focused on being, like as good as possible. And the world...
That's tough.
Yeah, the worldview I had was very, like when we were talking with Dr. Barbeau the other day, it's very objective. There's like one view of truth, and my dad was really into apologetics. And so when I was a teenager, I think I was maybe 13 or 14, I read like Scaling This Secular City by J.P. Moreland. Those are the kinds of books and books by Ravi Zacharias and stuff like that. That was actually like some of the first books I remember reading, which weren't novels. They were, apologetics types books. Yeah. And so I was really focused on that and a lot of big focus on like knowing and intellectual stuff. And so it wasn't until I got to college that I actually got really introduced to like Lewis and Tolkien and the Wade Center authors. I had actually read some of the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid as well. My sister got a consolidated copy of the Chronicles of Narnia. It was like all of them bound into this giant book. And it has like a picture of Aslan on the front. And I, as a kid, I was like, what is this with this lion on the front of it? And so I can't remember the specific order that they are in the book, but I got through reading it, but I think I didn't read Silverchair, The Last Battle, and I don't think I actually read Magician's Nephew. And so I read it and I was kind of like, okay, yeah, that was a thing that happened. But my brain was more focused on like learning facts and truth and apologetics and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I was in college and I was working at the school newspaper and somebody went to the Lord of the Rings website. This is like a new thing, and this is an old IMAX. This is 2001.
Yep.
And I remember we downloaded this trailer for the movie, and it was the one where they're like walking across a hill or something. They're like backlit. And that's the only image I remember. But I remember we waited forever for it to download, and then it opens and it's this tiny little window.
Yes. I remember those days well.
Yeah. So I saw that, and people were talking about it. They were so excited, and I had never read The Lord of the Rings before. And so I was like, well, I don't want to watch the movies without reading the books because everybody keeps talking about them, and I've never read them.
Yeah. And
so I went and got a copy of them. I have one of my copies of I think the Two Towers with me.
Yeah. It's got Christopher Lee on the cover.
It does have Christopher Lee. So it's from the movie series that came out in 2001. And I read that, fell in love with it, and then discovered that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were friends. And so then I would, because this is 2001, I would go to like Barnes and Noble.
Yes.
And just go to like the Christian bookstore section. And it turns out that like Tolkien and Chesterton and Lewis and MacDonald books were all kind of in the same area. And so I just started reading as many of them as I could.
Wow.
And it was the Space Trilogy that really landed with me. And so I brought my copy of Perelandra. That'd probably be my...
Wait, the Tolkien book isn't the book you chose?
No. It's here. It's on the table.
You snuck in another book.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because like Tolkien for me at that age was, I think I reread that series like twice a year when I was in college. Yeah. But for me, it was more of like an escape. I didn't really think of it through the lens of like shaping me spiritually or intellectually. It was just a sort of a fantasy story that I could escape into. But when I read Perelandra, that really kind of reshaped my worldview.
There's something about Perelandra that, I mean, did it resonate with that background in apologetics you had? Was that part of it? So much of it is like argument.
Yeah. I think that was part of what resonated with it. For me, it was the back and forth. But I think the thing that broke through for me was in the end, he realizes he can't win through argumentation.
That's right.
And he has this moment where he sort of surrenders to his fate and what God has planned for him, and then he ends up fighting the unman.
Yeah.
And then this moment at the end where Venus is given to Adam and Eve, the Tauran Tinadrill, to rule over. And I think that moment just like broke open my imagination and made me start to see Christianity and Christian faith through a different lens.
Wow.
And so that in some way that stuck with me, and I continue to go back to that story. I mean, listeners of the podcast have probably heard me quote from Perelandra or reference
numerous times
on numerous occasions. So it's definitely at the top of my list.
So Lord of the Rings isn't one of my books that I was going to talk about, but since you brought it up and used it as a book, as a platform, a stepping stone to another.
Well, we can talk about it. I plan on talking about it later.
Okay. I'll just say the first time I read that book, my grandparents were from Kansas, and their farmhouse had an old wood-burning stove in it that was used to heat the house.
Wow.
And right by, or at least part of the house, and right by the wood-burning stove was like a lazy boy chair. And one Christmas, I was from Indiana, we were visiting in Kansas. One Christmas, I read a good portion of Lord of the Rings sitting in that chair with my feet being warmed by the wood-burning stove. It was just a great, great memory.
Yeah.
And I was totally lost in that book and probably didn't talk to anybody that entire Christmas.
For years, it was my Christmas tradition to read through the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, that's great.
I actually, since we're talking about it, I will mention one passage. So one of the things that actually stood out to me when I read through Lord of the Rings and is subtly reshaped the way I see the world, without I think realizing it at the time, was the Ents in the story.
Yeah.
And something about personifying trees and then describing Saruman and the orcs and how they're chopping them down broke through for me. I had always had a love of nature and of creation, but I didn't have a theology to justify it. So I loved animals, and we had a pet, and I loved cats, and I loved nature and going outside. I spent a lot of time outdoors and climbed trees when I was a boy and things like that. But there was this big gap between the sort of theology that I had been raised with and the way I saw the world, or how much I appreciated it. And it wasn't until I found Tolkien that I was like, oh, he's just talking about it imaginatively, but like in The Two Towers, he talks about the orc work, the wanton hewing. And then he describes Saruman as the treachery of a neighbor who should have helped us. And just this idea of cutting down and destroying trees and not even using them, just to fuel fires, to do other things, and he talks about how he knew some of those trees and they were his friends and things like that. I don't know, that broke through for me in a way that I don't think an intellectual argument could have at the time. And so I think maybe without knowing it, that was why I kept coming back to them.
Yeah,
was because there was a worldview in those books that was redemptive. For the sort of very intellectual, objective truth, one way of seeing things, sort of almost an anesthetized worldview that I grew up with.
Oh, that's awesome. That actually reminds me of another book that I brought.
Yeah.
And that is, and it's not by one of the Wade authors. This is a more recent book. It's called The Overstory by Richard Powers.
Oh.
Won a Pulitzer. And it is, in many ways, I think of it it's not a fantasy. But it is a book about a collection of individuals who are very closely each identified with a different species of tree.
Oh.
And they come together, and it's a story about America, and it's a story about the ways in which it's a story about environmental stewardship, essentially.
Okay.
And I think it pairs really well with what you were just talking about in terms of the Lord of the Rings, because it's all about trees, and it's in some ways it's about a fellowship of the rings of these people committed to preservation of nature.
Interesting. So are they? Is it different? It's a series of stories of different people at different times.
Yeah, and it's generational. So it start. So we'll get there. We'll get there. In a lot of cases, their family backstory.
Oh, okay.
But then these characters, these main characters, emerge at the same time, and they're each kind of associated with a different species of tree, as I was saying. And there's a poem by George Herbert called "The Flower," and in that poem, the poem's really about forgiveness and redemption and the ways in which flower dies, but it comes back.
Yeah,
and our lives are like that. And one line in the poem is, "Who would have thought that my heart could have recovered greenness?"
Ooh.
And in some ways, it's about these characters who come to see the world and their relationship with nature in that kind of way. That's what the Overstory is about.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful book.
Yeah.
I think, like I said, I think it pairs really well with some of the messages that Tolkien is giving us.
Yeah, definitely. When did you come across that book? How long have you been?
This has been several years, maybe 3 or 4 years. So actually, one of the Hansen respondents, Christina Bieber Lake, talked about it in relation to, I believe she talked about it in relation to Kristen Page's book on stewardship.
Okay.
And then, now I teach it as part of my course on Tolkien and environmental stewardship.
You guys can't see this, but Jim's copy has all kinds of paper stuffed in there, lots of dog-eared pages, which that makes me happy, actually, because people always used to give me a hard time because all my copies have dog-eared pages, and people make fun of me for it. But when I want to go back and find something, I can look through there and go, oh, I remember this page here and I read. Okay, so since you mentioned Kristen Page, I have to invoke her again. I figure this is how this is going to go.
The Kristen Page segue.
Exactly. So when I came here to Wheaton to get my second master's degree, I ran into a number of instances where people would refer to or make some sort of connection to this phrase from Perelandra that had resonated with me. And I'm going to read the quote. I've read it before, but I'm just going to read it again. Okay, so at the end of Perelandra, chapter 17, they're on the mountain, and the angel the Oyarsa is about to give charge of the world to Tor. And Tinadril, the Eve of the planet, is the one that's been tempted and come through on the other side. Only because Ransom destroyed the unman he removed the temptation for. And so the king says, I know what he is thinking, talking about Ransom, looking upon the queen. He is thinking that you suffered and strove, and I have a world for my reward. Then he turned to Ransom and continued, You are right, he said. I know now what they say in your world about justice, and perhaps they say well, for in that world things always fall below justice, but Maleldil always goes above it. All is gift. I am Oyarsa, not by his gift alone, but by our foster mothers, not by hers alone, but by yours, not by yours alone, but by my wife's, nay, in some sort, by gift of the very beasts and birds. Through many hands, enriched with many different kinds of love and labor, the gift comes to me. It is the law. The best fruits are plucked for each by some hand that is not his own. So, Kristen came to a class that I was actually taking with Dr. Barbeau, Jeff Barbeau. We just had on the podcast.
Yeah.
This is all going to sound like, it sounds silly, but we all kind of, now know each other here at Wheaton. But she came and she was, it was a class on interdisciplinary theology. So we were taking other disciplines and trying to think about them through a theological lens and then letting those disciplines inform our theology. So we talked about math and theology, and Dr. Page came and talked about science and environmentalism and theology. And she referenced a book by Joseph Sittler, who is this Lutheran theologian, and she mentioned this copy of her book. She actually had it with her. She brought it out of her backpack. It said Evocations of Grace. And she was like, this is my most precious possession.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, that's a radical thing for somebody to say. And so she was talking about the book, and she was sharing with us this paper that she had written, which she talked about in her podcast with us, where she was talking about her Hansen lectures. And so I was like, well, I got to get a copy of that book. But at the time, you couldn't buy it online, and I couldn't find it in any local bookstores. So I was writing a paper, and I went to Dr. Page, and I was like, can I borrow your book? Because I need to pull a quote from it for my paper. And she was kind of like, yeah, okay, I'll let you borrow it. She was very trusting of me. And so I borrowed it, and there's a lot of stuff I could read from here. But the thing that stood out for me was...
Wait, that's not her copy,
It's not her copy. This is my own copy. Eventually, they put it back in print.
Okay.
And I went and grabbed a copy. So for a while there, you could only get it digitally, and then they started reprinting it as a physical copy. So I think it was sometime after the pandemic. I don't know, maybe there was a renewed focus on him or something, but it went from being out of print to... It was one of those ones where I think you could get a hard copy, but the price on Amazon was like $1,500 or something.
Sure,
you know what I mean? Anyway, so in the introduction, one of the authors is describing his theology of grace, and he quotes Sittler saying, "When the world is received as a gift, a grace, an ever-astounding wonder, it can be rightly enjoyed and justly used." And in that context, he's talking about part of what it is for us to sin is actually to enjoy things that are supposed to be used and use things that are supposed to be enjoyed.
Augustinian.
The Augustinian. And he goes on to talk about that, but his focus there is on sort of creation and how we distort creation, and rather than seeing all these things that God has created as a gift, we tend to use them for ourselves. And so that quote really stood out to me. So I grabbed a copy of this book, and it really, honestly, it changed my life.
Wow.
Very powerful. Could not put it down. I actually had the digital copy, and my wife and I were at the zoo in Chicago, and I would just stop and read the book in the zoo, and my wife would be like, "What are you you're not looking at the monkeys or whatever?" And I'm like, "No, I'm like
Evocations of Grace."
Yeah, I'm reading this sermon from Joseph Sittler that he preached in the 1970s or whatever. But it just it so resonated with me, and so this continues to be one of my favorite books that I keep coming back to. But I think the thing that it taught me was it helped me begin to develop a theology that made sense of the world and appreciation for creation that I had been introduced to in Lord of the Rings through Tolkien.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. And I love that idea that part of the gift of creation is the wonder of it.
Yeah.
That's just kind of an astonishing claim.
Yeah, he talks in here a lot about how part of what it means to be in right relation with creation is understanding that there are things that God created in creation that are meant to be themselves.
Yeah.
They may not actually be of any use to us.
Mm-hmm.
They're just there. They're beautiful because God enjoys them and he wants them to exist for their own purpose. And part of what it means to grow and become more spiritually mature is to recognize that it's okay. We don't have to look at everything in creation and go, well, how can we use that?
Yeah, just enjoy it.
Yeah.
As it is enjoying God, essentially.
And let it be itself.
Let it be itself. That's fantastic. Use and enjoyment. So you talked about Augustine.
Okay.
I think I got a connection.
Okay, here's a segue. This actually sounds like a fun game. Like, how can you segue into another book that you love?
That's right. It's a party game. Everybody's doing it. So this book was important to me in college. One of my professors in college was Alan Jacobs.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, and listeners might know him from The Narnian and many other things.
Yeah.
And The Narnian is a wonderful book. But the book I wanted to talk about is A Theology of Reading: The Hermeneutics of Love.
Oh.
The starting point for the book, in many ways, is Augustine.
Oh, okay.
And Augustine has this idea that he expresses in his book on Christian teaching, De Doctrina Christiana, that when we're reading Scripture, we should, as we're reading it, our reading should build up the double love for God and neighbor. So we should use the twofold commandment as a kind of interpretive scheme.
Yeah.
And if your reading of Scripture isn't building up love for God and neighbor, you're not reading Scripture rightly.
Yeah.
So it's a really powerful idea.
Yeah. And
so this book by Dr. Jacobs says, well, if that's true of Scripture, maybe we should think about that in terms of everything we read.
Yeah.
The idea is, whether you're reading, Jane Austen or whoever, you should be thinking about the ways in which your reading is building up love for God and neighbor.
Interesting.
I just love that idea.
Yeah.
And so he's got, various chapters on justice, chapters on knowledge, love and knowledge.
Okay.
But it's a really wonderful book, and it started me thinking about how I read.
So is the focus on finding those themes and connecting them, or using that to develop empathy, or how does he sort of take that hermeneutic and apply it?
Yeah, so he basically reads various texts.
Oh, he gives you examples. Oh,
yeah, he
okay, cool.
gives various examples, and kind of talks about different angles on this. Kind of develops the idea out.
Gotcha.
So like for example, how should we think about our reading in terms of humility? Is reading and charity, reading with the law of love in mind, connected to reading humbly?
Yeah.
So he's got a chapter on humility and kenosis.
Okay.
Kind of self-emptying.
Yeah.
What does that mean
Yeah.
to kind of think about kenosis before a text?
Yeah.
Anyway, highly recommended. And several years ago now, I was talking to one of my colleagues, Dr. Gibson, Richard Gibson in the English department, and he said, we should think about this idea as it pertains to writing. Augustine said this for scripture.
Oh, okay.
Jacob said this for reading.
Yeah.
What does it mean to think about the law of love in terms of writing? So that's where the book Charitable Writing came from. That's kind of its genesis.
Awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my Augustinian connection.
Okay. Well, then, while we're there, I'm going to mention two books. So going back to the theme, just showing how everything in my life kind of loops back through the book of Perelandra. My wife and I, previous career, I was doing ministry work. I was an adult education pastor, doing associate ministry work, and putting together curriculum and teaching and things like that. And then at some point in the process, we realized that we couldn't have kids. And we went through this big struggle with infertility. And that really was like a watershed moment for me, because I realized that I had grown up thinking that because I had tried so hard to be good, and I had tried so hard to have the right faith and know the right things, that deep down I had assumed that God owed me something. And so the idea that God wouldn't give me this good thing that I wanted, that I thought would be good for the world and good for him, was just like really disruptive to my faith. It really threw me for a loop. And that's how I ended up kind of coming back to Perelandra and finding that quote about all this gift and realizing I'm not owed anything, like not just in terms of, whether or not I can have kids of my own, but whether or not, I exist at all, everything about my life. And so that kind of sent me finding these other things. And around that time, I came across a Bible study, sort of a curriculum. It's like a video-driven curriculum. I think you can probably still find copies of it online. It's called For the Life of the World, which some astute listeners may realize is the title of a book by Alexander Schmemann. And I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know anything about Greek Orthodox theologians. And so I watched the series, and he references Perelandra in the series.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And I had come across it because it was just promoted to me because I was putting together discipleship classes for my church. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. And so in the middle of it, I'm like, oh, he's referencing my favorite book and my favorite quote. And then it's also named after this book by this theologian that I've never read. I'm like, maybe I should grab a copy of that. So I did. So one of my books is For the Life of the World by Schmemann. And the thing, again, it's like you don't realize that, all this stuff is connected until you pick it up. You pick up the book and you're like, oh, there's a reason why that resonated with me. Too much to get into, but one of the things that he talks about in here is basically that if everything that we have comes to us as a gift from God, then there really is no sacred, secular distinction in the world.
Yeah.
And when we make that distinction, we're actually repeating the fall, where we're saying, here are things that are God's domain, and here are things that are not God's domain. Yeah. And over here, I have to act and behave a certain way, or God is going to step in and do something miraculous. But in this, secular, profane area, it's different. We talk about like natural grace versus supernatural grace, or common grace, things like that.
Yeah.
And he has a line in here I wanted to just quote. He says, "Man is a hungry being, but he is hungry for God. Behind all the hunger of our life is God. All desire is finally a desire for him. To be sure, man is not the only hungry being. All that exists lives by eating. The whole creation depends on food. But the unique position of man in the universe is that he alone is to bless God for the food and the life he receives from him. He alone is to respond to God's blessings with his blessing." And he goes on to say, To name a thing, he's talking about Adam naming things at creation. He says, to name a thing is to manifest the meaning and value God gave it, to know it as coming from God, and to know its place and function within the cosmos created by God. And I grabbed a copy of this, and I think I skimmed it, and it didn't really land with me at first. And it wasn't until I moved up here and I was going to start the grad school program. And I had about 3 months where I didn't have a job, and I was looking for a job, and I was waiting for school to start. And I just, was like doing a lot of spiritual searching. And when I read that, it just like really clicked for me, and really landed for me. And then that leads me to a second book. I'm going to do a duo here.
That's great.
That led me to revisit George MacDonald's Unspoken Sermons.
Ooh.
There's something about having like a book that is a bunch of smaller, messages and books.
Totally.
That makes it easy to go, oh, let me go check that out, because I don't have to read all of them.
That's right.
I can just read one of them at a time, right?
Skip around.
Exactly. And so one of them that I read is The Word of Jesus on Prayer in Unspoken Sermons 2. And in it, MacDonald is really wrestling with, why do we have to ask for anything in prayer? Like, what's the point of prayer if God is all-knowing and he knows what we need, and he has everything we need? What is the point of us asking for him, asking things in prayer? It really almost seems kind of like mean and cruel to be like, oh, I have everything you need. It's right here. Everything belongs to me. I'm all powerful, but you got to come to me and ask for stuff, right?
MacDonald has an answer for that.
He does have an answer for that. And so what stood out to me was his answer sounded a lot like what I had read in Lewis, which obviously, because Lewis has been influenced by MacDonald. It also sounded a lot like what I had read from Alexander Schmemann, and it really resonated with me. So he says, and I'll quote a few things from here because I think I've read these quotes in full before, but he says, what if the main object in God's idea of prayer to be the supplying of our endless need is the need of himself? What if the good of all our smaller and lower needs lies in this, that they help drive us to God? Mm-hmm. Hunger may drive the runaway child home, and he may or may not be fed at once, but he needs his mother more than his dinner. Communion with God is the one need of the soul beyond all other need. Prayer is the beginning of that communion. And he goes on to say this one passage here that I've quoted, where eventually he says, like, the real good of every gift is that the giver is in the gift. Yeah. And so when we realize that every gift that we have comes from God, we're actually receiving him. That is how we actually live in communion with him. Yeah. And the purpose of prayer is to constantly remind us that everything that we have comes to us from him, that it is a gift. And so in the end, towards the end of the section, he says, no gift unrecognized as coming from God is at its own best. Therefore, many things that God would gladly give us, things even that we need because we are, must wait until we ask for them, that we may know whence they come. When in all gifts we find him, then in him we shall find all things.
Wow. And there's a recovery in the of the sacredness of all of life. Yeah. In that. Yeah. Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah. So when I read that, I was just like, wow, okay. I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready for this next stage with grad school and all this stuff. And a lot of the things started to kind of line up. And I think that helped to heal some of the woundedness that I had in me of like, don't I deserve this good thing?
Wow.
So yeah.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. Okay, should we take a short break here? So just a reminder that you can email us. We'd love to hear from you. And if you would email us your top 5 books, or as many as you want to include, we will perhaps even read some of your reflections on air about them. My next book is from one of my heroes. I'm not sure this has a strong Wade Center connection, but this was really important to me during graduate school.
Okay.
So one of the things that I did during graduate school is I got very interested in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions.
Okay.
Which are commissions that are usually, in most cases, designed to help a country or community transition from something like apartheid or some injustice in their context to something better, usually like a democracy.
Gotcha.
The most famous one was in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So South Africa, basically an apartheid regime for many, many years. And when Nelson Mandela was eventually elected president, of course, it's a long story, but when he was eventually elected president and released from prison, a lot of people in the country said, we need to figure out what's happened and figure out a way to move beyond or move through what's happened.
Yeah.
And so they decided to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Mm.
And the idea was that people who had been harmed, survivors, could come tell their stories publicly.
Oh, wow.
About what happened. And perpetrators of crimes were invited to come tell their stories too.
Oh, wow.
And the idea was that not that they would be given kind of blanket amnesty or national amnesty, but if you came and told your story and confessed, you would be given individualized amnesty.
Oh.
There's more to it than that, but the point of all this is at the center of that operation, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Desmond Tutu.
Oh, okay.
Who is, as I said, one of my heroes. And he wrote a book about this process called No Future Without Forgiveness.
Oh, wow.
And it is just it's an amazing book about forgiveness in general, but also just about how we're related to one another as human beings. In the book, he talks about a South African concept called Ubuntu, the idea that we're not individual selves, not separate selves, kind of more Western view of the self.
Yeah.
But the idea is I am who I am because of who we all are.
Yeah.
We're kind of caught in this web.
Yeah.
We're interconnected. And so, like, if I harm you, that harms me.
Yeah.
If I lift you up, I'm built up.
Yeah.
So it's this very powerful idea. And he used it to kind of warrant a lot of the operations of the commission and to kind of build up people. So anyway, just a really powerful book. And I went on to write about the kind of rhetoric of these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So the way they function to persuade and things like that. So, anyway.
Well, so that leads me to think about another book that I had on here. So when I was in ministry, I came across the book Ethics by Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Oh, yeah.
And I tried to read it, and I did. I mean, I read the whole thing, but I don't know that it made a whole lot of sense to me. And so it wasn't until I was in grad school, and there was a class on Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Oh.
And I was like, well, I want to sign up for that class.
Yes.
And so basically that class was reading everything that he had written or that had been compiled that he had done. And great class. And so one of the books that landed with me out of that is what's called Creation and Fall by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but it's actually a compilation or a collection of notes taken by his students based on a lecture series that he gave.
Was it at his underground seminary, or was it
No,
something?
It was when he was lecturing in 1933.
Okay.
And I think he was either had just gotten his doctorate or was in the process of getting it, and he was lecturing, and he decided he wanted to teach on the book of Genesis.
Oh, awesome.
And so there's a whole series of lectures that have been reconstructed by student notes, which that's like something to aspire to.
Yes,
right?
Totally.
As a professor, to be like, could you recreate my lecture from my students' notes?
It's actually a terrifying thought.
I know, right? So yeah, it raises a lot of questions. Because I'm reading something that is put together from all these notes in German, then translated in English.
Yeah.
So it would be fascinating to compare this to what he actually said. But this book, I think what it did for me was reshaped the way that I looked at the book of Genesis, but particularly about the sort of gender roles, men and women. There's a lot of debate and it never ends of complementarianism versus egalitarianism and all this sorts of stuff. And that's something that I've always been sort of personally going back to and reevaluating. And there's a passage in here though that really stood out to me where he's talking about, and this is a concept that Bonhoeffer talks about in other places. And so I think he talks about it in ethics as well. And this is where kind of a light bulb went off for me. I was like, oh, okay, that made sense of some of the things that I read in his ethics. But he introduces this idea that freedom is not really a thing in and of itself, that we in contemporary Western culture define freedom as freedom from something. Yeah. So oftentimes in sort of American political discourse, we talk about, freedom, but it's the context of, well, the government has passed some rule and I want to be free to not have to abide by that rule, or freedom from religion versus, other things. And that tends to work in this individualized sense in that, like, I don't want you to tell me what to do. I want to be free to do whatever I can do.
Yes.
And it overlooks the idea, the reality that, like you said, that Ubuntu concept, that we're all, the actions that I take for myself are going to impact other people. Yeah. So we say things like, oh, well, what harm is it if you do XYZ within the confines of your own house? Right. And we talk about that in relation to things like marijuana and stuff like that. And I'd always think to myself, like, well, yeah, you might be able to smoke marijuana in isolation within the privacy of your own home, but like you have a family, you have brothers, sisters, you have a spouse, you may have kids or whatever, and everything that you do impacts them in some way or another. And so we're never really truly free. And so Bonhoeffer says we need to be thinking about freedom in terms of what are we free for? What are we free to do? And that is how we actually need to be constrained by other people, or realize that we're being constrained by them. And then the question is, what are we going to use our freedom, our ability to make decisions, what are we going to use that for? Yeah. And so he says, freedom is not a quality that can be uncovered. It's not a possession, something to hand, an object, nor is it a form of something to hand. Instead, it is a relation and nothing else. To be more precise, freedom is a relation between two persons. Being free means being free for the other, because I am bound to the other. Only by being in relation with the other am I free. Mm-hmm. And that was a really radical idea, but it made me think of the quote that you had there from Desmond Tutu, and that idea that, what it really means for me to exercise my freedom in a God-honoring way is not actually for me to be thinking about how I can use it for myself, but how am I using it for other people?
Yeah, that's really great. Okay, we're going to do a hard turn.
Okay.
Because I don't have anything.
You don't have a good segue.
I'm not sure if I do.
Oh, that's fine.
Goodness gracious. I mean, I could talk about the Great Divorce. I mean, that would make total sense in light of what you're saying here. So I just assigned this book to the Wade Center Continuing Scholars.
Oh, okay.
So the Wade Center Continuing Scholars Program is a program that you kind of attend a lot of our lectures, either in person or online. You read a book with us and do some research in our reading room, or read something you haven't read before. It's pretty. The bar is not super high, but you kind of enter in it where you want.
Yeah.
And then you get a certificate. So anyway, I've been thinking a lot about the Great Divorce.
Okay.
This book has been important to me for a long time. And I think what I love about this book is that many of our listeners will know the story, but the narrator, Lewis, a version of Lewis, right, is making a journey from the gray town into this essentially, foyer to heaven, and
the foothills,
of heaven, and he, is encountering a lot of ghosts or shades that are coming along, and they are meeting people, emissaries from heaven, who are trying to get them to come further up and further in, essentially. And almost everybody turns away.
Yeah.
And I think, all of them are trapped in themselves. And so they don't have this real freedom that you're talking about. They don't have this freedom that is born out of relationships and commitments.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's my segue.
Each of the characters is almost insisting upon continuing to do something that is preventing them from, coming to heaven. And it's often, a very selfish way of thinking about it. But they often couch it in terms of, I have to do this thing for somebody else, but it's really for them.
For themselves. And it's this kind of faulty view of freedom that is eventually results in isolation.
Yeah.
Which is why Lewis's picture of the great town is this situation in which people grow further and further apart from one another.
Yep.
But this time when I was reading this book with the continuing scholars, I've always thought that, almost nobody makes it. There's only like one character that we're sure of that makes it in this story. And I've always thought that it was a very astute picture of human sinfulness. But this time when I was reading it, I was just struck by the bright spirits that are meeting the characters and how they're joyful, how their lives are caught up in this larger life of God, and how Lewis in the book gives us both sides of this, and just how beautiful a lot of those portraits are.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've been thinking about the Great Divorce a lot, and also just the cleverness of Lewis throughout the book is just remarkable.
Yeah,
I mean, right from the beginning, he's got one of the ghosts is basically. Let's see, I'll just find it here. Just take a second. So right from the beginning here, one of the ghosts is complaining that another ghost is conceited. But he himself, this ghost is himself conceited. And so this ghost is complaining this other ghost has nothing left but his self-conceit, he says. But immediately he wants to try to read something to Lewis. So he himself is conceited. So it's a great moment right from the beginning that we need to be on the lookout that these ghosts are really us.
Yeah.
So he's just so good at convicting us.
Yeah, definitely.
But also bringing us along into that heavenly country.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot more books here that I think we probably want to go through in the second part of this podcast.
These stacks aren't getting any smaller.
No. But I think I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think we should keep going. But again, we want to put that out there for the listeners. Send us an email at wade@wheaton.edu with at least your top 5 books and how they impacted you or played a role in your life. The more Wade Center authors you guys include, the better. But obviously, we've read a lot of people that are not part of the Wade Center authors.
I've got some more Wade adjacent choices as well in my stack.
Okay. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I didn't mention a couple of the ones that I have. So we'll come back and we'll do a part 2. Hopefully that will include some thoughts and comments and list of books from you guys. And, if anything, hopefully you can walk away from this with some books to explore and read.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. And I hope we get some books to read from our listeners.
I know. Yeah. I'm looking forward to the books that they recommend because I'm sure they have great ideas. I really want to read that book that you mentioned about the Overstory.
Oh, yeah. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Next time, I'm going to be talking about Piranesi by Susanna Clark.
Okay.
Oh, my goodness.
All right. I see another book over there that's actually on my list I'm really looking forward to talking about. So we'll save that for episode 2. So we'll see you guys in part 2 of this episode. Don't forget to send us an email at wade@wheaton.edu.
All right. Take care.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.